Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives 5 is out, and it has far more LGBT plus representation than his previous works, which has led to accusations of him having gone completely woke, and even people going so far to say he has abandoned or betrayed his faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, as myself, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and someone who has spoken to Brandon about this stuff, and also followed his career for, more than 15 years, listening to his positions very closely, because I've always felt he's a gentleman worthwhile listening to. I think I can share a bit of nuance on this discussion and clear up a couple of things. So the first thing to discuss, has Brandon gone woke? This is more complex than people might think, because even though I feel woke is a useful term in identifying things that are regressive, founded on intersectional ideology, and overall, I think, very destructive, the amount that people are woke or not, unlike gender, which is a binary, one or the other, people's ideological leanings exist more on a spectrum. And so to classify someone as woke usually would give someone the impression that they are a full-blown activist pushing for all the woke agenda. And if that is their sense of woke, no, Brandon isn't a woke activist. He is far more progressive and left-leaning than the general tenor of church membership, myself included. He has said that, by the way, in public statements. But if Brandon Sanderson is woke, and if the state of the world is that people are going to be some measure of woke because that's just the differences in people's viewpoints, he would be the type of woke we would hope every type of woke person or woke-leaning person to be. Okay? Brandon does not support cancel culture in any measure. In fact, I was a consultant on Stormlight Archives 4, and people complained about it on Reddit trying to get me cancelled from ever working or associating Brandon in the future, and Brandon defended me and didn't cancel me. He is nowhere near an unhinged activist in that sense, and he has always pushed for the standard of being open and having open discussion and listening to people who he disagrees with, and having a position of tolerance and acceptance, which used to be the mantras for the woke crowd, where it's all about tolerance and acceptance, except if you disagree with us, then you are a bigot and should be shunned completely, where that's not Brandon at all. He has many friends and associates happily with people who are very right-leaning and conservative. And just on those two things alone, that is willing to keep dialogue and associations open with people on the right, and that he doesn't go on the whole cancel mob. Those two things are usually being associated so much with the woke movement that people sometimes even define wokeism by those practices, which is actually a complete misunderstanding of what I think the fundamental things of wokeism is. And that misunderstanding has led to this, I think, silly notion of the concept of the woke right, where people identify the woke right as people on the right who adopt certain practices that are similar to those people on the woke left, and those practices being cancel culture and intolerance, stopping association with people who disagree with you, acting like the classic SJW in the old terms. Because what is woke, like when you really try and understand it, isn't defined by the way people necessarily act to people who politically disagree with them. In some instances, some it is, right? But it's more defined. It is absolutely more defined by the underlying philosophy, the concepts of intersectionality and representation, diversity, before anything else as the primary thing, and then the natural practices that evolve out of those, beliefs and philosophies, like affirmative action, reparations, and actual, bigoted racist practices against people who they perceived as being their oppressors, all right? Which leads to real racism and bigotry against the most worst person in the world, according to the woke ideology, which is straight white men. And with that understanding, the woke right is a thing that is a contradictive statement upon itself. It's impossible for people who fundamentally disalign and reject these philosophies, because those philosophies are the philosophies that define as being woke, to then be woke. It's impossible for them to be woke if they reject those philosophies because that is what is woke. And so you cannot have the woke right if the definition is right, as it probably is traditional conservatism, which is the rejection of the far more left-leaning philosophies of intersectionality. So conflating those with practices of cancel culture and other things like that misses the mark. Now, bringing this to Brandon, he does not adopt the practices of the woke mob, and he has not shared much about his fundamental philosophy, although he is more progressive than a lot of traditional conservatives, and perhaps even a decent chunk, myself included, of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But is being woke including or even promoting parts of the woke ideological movement, including the LGBT representation? Well, it depends, because the practices of DEI and representation both in hiring and prominence in media, only for the sake of representation itself in lieu of something like merit and what is simply the best and most appropriate choice for the story, all those practices are founded on intersectionality at their core. But remember, this is a spectrum, okay? A lot of people probably agree in small parts with certain woke either policies or ideological positions, as many people that we would define as wholly woke probably have many small things about conservatism and conservative beliefs and practices that they align with and agree with. Although it does seem a bit less in the woke movement because they're ready to excommunicate anyone for the slightest, divergence from their dogmatic belief structure, like J.K. Rowling rejecting the trans movement, and she agrees with everything else. She's very woke at everything else, but that makes her worse than Hitler. So with that foundation laid out, the question arises once again, is Brandon Sanderson woke? Well, certainly not in the sense of supporting cancel culture and the woke mob and disassociating people and the like, but he is more woke or more progressive than many right-leaning people, like myself included. And then in extension to that question, has he gone woke? Well, he's become more progressive as the years go on. You can see his ideological kind of leanings shift over time. So yes, Brandon is a little woke. He's also a little bit conservative. He's not a full-blown activist, as I've already mentioned. And I think one of the big distinctions that people who are being critical of Brandon need to understand about him is that the manifestations of certain woke ideological elements in his writing works and statements is not coming out of him adhering to a gender. I honestly don't know how much he agrees with the concepts of intersectionality. He's never spoken on it to my knowledge. He might not agree with it at all. In fact, when he has explained why he has put these type of things in his book, it is not for the adherence to an ideological agenda or to subvert traditional standards and traditional family relationships. In fact, Brandon seems to go out of his way in all of his books to promote and depict marriage in a very positive light. Relationship progression and marriage between Vin and Eland in Mistborn, and particularly the relationship between Steris and Wax in the Wax and Wayne trilogy, is one of my favorite in all of literature. It really depicts the complementary relationship between men and women, how much they rely on each other and can support and help one another in their traditional roles. It's just genuinely phenomenal. Brandon has constantly depicted and supported positive marriage and positive traditional values and is going to continue doing that. This is a fundamental morality and belief that he has. And remember, just having gay characters in a story doesn't necessarily make it woke. It depends how it's portrayed. Are they real characters? What is it promoting or trying to normalize? Because it would be incorrect to assume that every time a gay character appears in a story or something like that, it's automatically an attempt at woke subversion. Sometimes things, expressions, might manifest that on the surface look quite similar, but the reason for it being can be vastly different, which the intention does matter, but that's not to discount the execution, okay? Even if, the intention was to achieve something very different, but the way it was played out ended up pushing in a different direction, well, the intention doesn't redeem it, but I think it is worth considering. Because for those people who are members of our church, yes, intention does matter as well as works. It's both. For I, the Lord, will judge all men according to their works, according to the desire of their hearts. Both plays an important role. And that's from Doctrine and Covenants 137, verse 9. So, is Brandon's intention to promote LGBT lifestyles as being superior or more celebratory to traditional lifestyles and traditional marriage? And or is that how it comes off in the book? Those things are important things to consider. And regarding intention, from everything I've heard from Brandon, it's not to promote certain lifestyles, but for him, an exercise to try and understand people better. And then an extension to enable people to be seen in his books. Now, I personally don't think every single person needs to be seen in every single bit of media. I don't think that's an obligation. I don't think that's something Brandon should necessarily take upon himself. It does seem though he has. And that honestly might be an interesting discussion I could have with Brandon about the purpose of trying to represent or have everyone be seen in his stories. Or like, why is that necessarily a good thing? Where I think the opposite might be the case. It might actually be a bad thing if you're pushing for everyone to be seen in your stories. Does everyone and every lifestyle deserve to be shown? I think every single person will have a certain line where it reaches a point where they would say, no, the life and perspective of a murderer, and I'm not trying to make it equivalent, I'm just giving an example that there is a line where people say, no, I don't want to see that lifestyle depicted. And then, of course, there will be some people who really want it. I mean, and look, I gotta say, I always kind of find it fun and interesting when a Mormon is depicted positively in media and accurately, because there is that side where you want people to understand you. I would love people to understand members of my church more because there's so much misunderstanding. So when they're depicted positively in the way that is correct, I really like that. And so I actually think Brandon has been approaching the LGBT representation actually from that perspective. And he's talked about this a lot. He has shared times where he's been reading a book and a character appears in the book that should be representing his perspective, like the perspective of a Christian, and they've been written as caricatures just there to be mocked and belittled as a joke because the author themselves don't like those people. And it's truly a horrible representation of who that person is supposed to represent. He's talked about this, and Brandon has said that his philosophy is to never do that. When he has a character that appears in his books, he goes out of his way to try and have that book be depicted like the people in the real world who associate or identify with that same characteristic, identity, or whatever, as they would want to be depicted. And that's an admirable thing. It's not necessarily an endorsement of what they believe, and from his perspective, not a promotion, though that one is a hard line to walk because what is promotion, can sometimes be more determined by how people receive the story, and sometimes intention can go astray. The thing that you need to understand about Brandon is that he is actually one of the most accepting, tolerant, and kindest people you'll ever meet. And he applies that equally to most people that he interacts with, regardless of their ideological leanings. And the way that he responds to people attacking him is with his such tolerance and understanding that it almost borders on superhuman. Because there was this hit piece article written about him, which was the most disingenuous crap you've ever read, right? And I don't think I could avoid being outraged at the bullcrap that this person who met him and talked with him and interacted with him in person, right? Brandon was really kind to and friendly with, then wrote all this slop about him, and he responded with such understanding and lack of outrage, which is kind of amazing. Now, that is actually a bit of a reflection of his own kind of mental, perspective, because Brandon has been outspoken that he has a bit of a neural divergent attitude where he doesn't get hugely upset or hugely overly emotional. He is a bit more restrained in his emotional kind of expression. And this does play into his position and also why the Stormlight Archives 5, Wind and Truth, has more representation in it. And you can clearly see why if you've listened to some of the things that is talked about in terms of his own, what he calls, neurodivergent, mental state.
As my friends hit puberty, they became more emotional. The opposite happened to me. Instead of experiencing the wild mood swings of adolescence, my emotions calcified. I started waking up each day feeling roughly the same as the day before, without variation. Often, it genuinely seems like I exist outside of human experience. It's not sociopathy. I'm quite empathetic. In fact, empathy is one of the ways that I can feel stronger emotions. I'm not autistic. I don't have a single hallmark of that notable brand of neurodivergence. It's also not what they call alexithmia, which is a condition where someone doesn't feel emotions or can't describe them. I care about people. I feel. I'm not empty or apathetic. My emotions are simply muted and hover in a narrow band. When I read or write from the eyes of other people, I legitimately feel what they do. There's a magic to any kind of story, yes, but for me, it's transformative. I live those lives. For a brief time, I remember exactly what passion and agony and hatred and ecstasy feel like. My emotions mold to the story, and I cry sometimes. I legitimately cry. I haven't done that outside of a story in 3 decades. So let me tell you why I write. It isn't about world building. That's a mistake everyone makes about me. I don't write for plot twists or dragons or clever turns of phrase, though I enjoy all of these. I write because stories bring people inside, and I sincerely, genuinely believe that is what the world needs. Only fantasy offers me the full range of emotion, the wonder of exploration, the magnificent highs of epic scope, and the miserable lows of cataclysmic terror. In writing it, I can learn. Monomaniacal, I hunt experiences of people who are different from myself, then explore them in prose until I feel, in some small part, what they do. This is why I write, to understand, to make people feel seen. I type away, hoping some lonely reader out there, left on a curb, will pick up one of my books, and in so doing, learn that even if there is no place for them elsewhere, I will make a place for them between these pages.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, because I think that'll help a lot of people being very critical of Brandon understand him a bit better. Because it does seem like this mental condition that he has does help him from getting angry and reacting very negatively, and he has responded incredibly well to people being really nasty and false with him. He is genuinely one of the nicest, most tolerant people you'll ever meet, and I mean that in the true sense of tolerance, open, and accepting, okay? And as I mentioned, if people were to be woke, this is the exact type of more progressive-leaning, woke, ideologically minded person you would want. Now, as to the greater amount of representation in Wind and Truth, I have not read the book yet. I have been very interested in hearing people's feedback of those parts in it. And from what I have been able to hear for myself, it certainly seems to be a bit more promotional in the sense of depicting it with more prominence in a way of normalizing it than I would choose to do in my own writing, and certainly more so than a lot of conservative people who just are fed up with the woke stuff in media are willing to tolerate. And a lot of people have rejected the book because it has this stuff in it to such a prominent level. It might not be as much as people are saying. Like I said, I haven't read the book yet. And I really think people on the conservative right should not have this barrier where it's like, you can't have gay people at all in any type of story. Because, yeah, gay people are in the world. And if you're depicting something realistically, there's very high chances that a gay person might be in that story as well. And there's examples of it being handled from my conservative perspective, and also very religious perspective, by the way, perfectly fine. House of the Dragon Season 1 has a very prominent gay character in it that's actually essential to the story. And that element in the story enhances the overall arc of the season very considerably. It's an essential part of the story, which I felt handled it perfect. Okay, it was fine. Having said that, I do hold different standards for what I think is appropriate to be included in adult entertainment versus children's entertainment, because I think it's the parents' choice and right to choose when to introduce these more mature concepts of sexual orientation and gender identity, all those things to children. It's the parents' choice, and therefore that stuff needs to be kept out of children's media completely. But when dealing with mature media, and adults get to choose where their kind of line of, tolerance is for what they, and by the way, when I say tolerance, right, there is a simple reality that I think people on the ultra woke side need to kind of accept. And it's that straight people, especially straight guys, get turned off by homosexual kissing and acts of homosexuality in front of their face because they're not attracted to it, all right? I don't see anyone on the left condemning homosexual men from probably being turned off by lesbian relationships and other things like that because they're not attracted to it. But they seem to hold this different standard for straight people. No, you need to watch it and not only accept it, they literally say now you need to celebrate it. Acceptance is enough. You have to be on board and celebrate and promote it. And if you don't, you're intolerant.
And then as far as with non-binary and transgender, he needs to not just accept it, but embrace it.
And that's just bonkers to me because I thought, hang on, I thought it was about tolerance and acceptance, treating them that these are just people and treating them as people and their sexual identity and stuff like that. Like, doesn't need to bother you because that should be something that's private, and gay people shouldn't be discriminated against. And I thought that was, the thing that we were pushing for. Okay, there we have acceptance and tolerance. But now you have to promote it and celebrate it, not only as something equivalent to traditional heterosexual relationships, which they're not equivalent. Okay, every homosexual relationship by definition is actually sterile. They can't have children in that relationship. And so biologically, there is clearly one relationship that is biologically superior, uncontestably, right? But then they push it further. You have to celebrate as something even more celebratory and praiseworthy as traditional relationships. It's like no. And if they want to celebrate that, what right do they have to condemn traditional people like me who want to celebrate traditional heterosexual relationships, marriage between a man and a woman, the unit that creates life, creates families, right? As holding that on the pedestal as the thing that we should be celebrate above all else. And it should be. That's my standard. But we get attacked for that, even though people who disagree with us ideologically promote and celebrate something, a thing that they believe to be much, much higher, right? Rules for thee and not for me, as it seems to be. And it's actually that standard. There's a lot of conservative, traditionally minded people that want to see the primary relationship of the human species, relationships between men and women, as the primary and even the only thing promoted and celebrated and sometimes even depicted in the media that they like to consume. And you can't take that away from them. That's their right to choose what they want to enjoy in their media or not. And there are a large number of people who, when they see any type of LGBT representation, they're just turned off by it. They're not into it. They're not gay. Shock horror, okay? And there has been a decent chunk of people who have been turned off by Wind and Truth because it has a much more further amount of representation in it. From the reports I've seen, it certainly doesn't go off a cliff where it's everything gay, everything like that, and promoting it as the greatest thing ever. And from what I understand about Brandon, that's not the intention either. His intention, looking at him, is about representing people in the world.
This is why I write. To understand, to make people feel seen. I type away, hoping some lonely reader out there, left on a curb, will pick up one of my books, and in so doing, learn that even if there is no place for them elsewhere, I will make a place for them between these pages.
Now, you might say that's odd because it's a fantasy world, and I really sympathize with people of this position where they feel a fantasy world shouldn't reflect the modern world that sometimes we go to fantasy to escape, and we want. Now, I was going to say a medieval world, but the Stormlight Archives is not a medieval world, okay? And it's more jarring when you have a medieval world, medieval fantasy, with modernisms in it, where it's really out of place and jarring. But the Stormlight Archives is not a medieval world. It's a whole different fantasy world where the world builder, author Brandon himself, will decide what things actually fit in that setting and even certain modern stuff. And it's not like he's gone off a cliff with throwing modernisms everywhere. There has been complaints that there's more modernisms that people necessarily like in Wind and Truth, but it's a crazy huge book. It seems like it's less than 0.1% or whatever of modernisms versus all the other very celebrated and praised world building of not only the setting, the book specifically. There is many things that people have been praising about Wind and Truth. Now, there are other things outside of any potential woke criticism, like has it gone too woke and stuff like that, people have been criticizing it for, about other issues in terms of the editing quality of the book, the pacing structure, and other things. I haven't read it, so I don't know. but I have been listening to people's feedback about the book, and so those things have arisen that people are saying there are other issues with Wind and Truth outside of, concerns about it going woke, but there are also vast amounts of praise for that book as well, things that people are absolutely loving. Now, if the amount of woke ideological LGBT type of representation in the book is too much for someone, that's their choice and simply choose not to read it. Now, I don't think then that people should assume that Brandon has then gone so woke that they'll never read anything he writes again. I think, personally, that's actually going way too far. Brandon has held these views, his more progressive-leaning views, for years. He's been pretty open about that, right? And has written books in the meantime, right? That many people that are more conservative-leaning, stuff like that, still love, that I love, all right? And so clearly, his intention is not to put this more progressive kind of stuff in every single book that he does. Brandon has an interesting approach to writing where he loves to explore people's different lifestyles that he, on account of his own neurodivergency, has trouble understanding and connecting with. And he's expressed the way that he connects with people and lifestyles that he doesn't understand is by writing them, and he explores them in his writing, and it leads him to being able to understand people more. It's one of the primary ways he expresses himself as an artist. And so one of the things that Brandon likes to do is to explore things a bit further that he hasn't explored before. Do not think that he is unaware of what makes a good book and what people like to read and want to enjoy. Every single book that he writes isn't a repetition of something that he has chosen to explore in a given book. Every book he writes isn't The Emperor's Soul, which is an exploration on the concepts of what is art. And it's an interesting kind of perspective wrapped up in a fun, interesting fantasy story, which is his style, But he explores it and then usually moves on to the next thing he likes to explore. He doesn't double down and keep pushing it, going over and over and over again. And so it's from that understanding that this is the way that Brandon usually approaches his writing, that there seems to be the time where Brandon wanted to explore a lifestyle in his writing to help understand it more. He has very close friends that identify with being LGBT and so on, and he has already mentioned that he comes to a great understanding of individuals by writing people of different lifestyles and viewpoints. And I think this is a direct manifestation of that. My own prediction is that I don't think his future books are going to be as woke as Wind and Truth is. And again, I don't even know how into, I suspect that it's a relationship that comprises a portion of a very large story, and that there are small scenes, and I've read some of the scenes, right, where he has a character that, they don't say they're trans in the book, but they show that they're identifying as a different gender, right? And it's a tiny scene in an overall really large book. And for me, I'm not sure that would ruin it, though, look, I get it. It depends how out of place it is, how pandering it feels. I don't know the context to feel how naturally it just fits in the story, because if it's as much as, oh, this character is either trans or this character is gay, they're in the world, that's who they are, okay then. It's not that's not a problem, okay? If that's the state of his world where people are gay, and yes, people are gay in the world, for me, it does depend how much it pushes to promote it, even normalize it, over something that I think is vastly more important for the human species, which is the traditional family unit. And if it doesn't do that, I don't think the worry or concern that Brandon has gone woke and is going to be putting all this woke ideological propaganda in his books is true. I don't think that is correct at all. He has written many books already, while still having the same more progressive leanings that he does, that doesn't have the extreme woke agenda in it. And I don't think Wind and Truth is a sign that every single book that he writes in the future is going to have a prominent gay relationship or gay romance in it, Understanding his perspective as an artist, this seems to be one of the times where he wanted to explore it to understand people better. Just like he did with The Emperor's Soul, and he does many different times. If you look through his writing, you'll see characters with different mindsets, different mental conditions, mental disabilities, viewpoints and lifestyles that he likes to explore as a writer, And then that's usually in the book, because his main focus is to write a world fantasy that people enjoy. His primary focus is to entertain, and then he has this joint kind of artistic expression where he likes to write different people and different lifestyles to understand them better. So in summary to this section specifically, if Wind and Truth is too woke for what you like to consume, that's fair. Don't then cancel Brandon or boycott him. How about you wait and see what he writes in the future to determine if you feel like he is pushing an ideological agenda? Because I do not think he has put this stuff in to appease either his publishers or the woke mob or anything like that. I think it's in there because he is such a friendly, open, tolerant guy where he accepts people for who they are, of many different, lifestyles and views and things, and he wants to understand them better. Brandon has that kind of stuff you money, right? He is on that uncancelable kind of line. He doesn't need tall books to be successful. He's got his crowd of it. He could be perfectly successful, completely independent, so it's definitely not trying to appease his publishers or anything like that, and I don't think it's to appease the ultra-progressive crowd demanding that he be, put in all this stuff in his writing, because one, he hasn't shown that track record that is doing that. Two, he's not denounced his faith or the leaders of the church. Okay, he's actually professed, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this because there's been even accusations that he is betraying his faith, and as a member of the same church, I want to share some important things on that topic. But he has professed complete sustaining of our prophet, President Russell M. Nelson, and a belief in the doctrine. There have been members that feel like there is a contradiction in what he is professing versus the doctrine of the church. I'm going to speak more about that in a bit. But if he was trying to appease the crowd, he would have denounced the church and gone wholesale. The woke mob hate it when people only kind of do it by half measures, all right? They're going to demand more and more, and I think you'll be surprised that Brandon is probably going to hold the line on certain standards because that's what he's done in the past. If he's more progressive now, it is not because he is trying to appease the woke mob. It's actually because of him genuinely changing as a person based on close friends that he has and his actual underlining beliefs. Many of which is clearly more progressive than me, all right, and we're members of the same faith, but members of the same faith can actually interpret things differently, and guess what? Our own faith has provision for it in our belief structure, where there is very clear fundamental doctrines outlined, and then there is a section where God allows us to make the choice ourselves as to how, I was going to say devout, but it's not necessarily about devotion. It's where we feel the offering we need to give to God is, okay? How much we feel God is expecting of us, such as there is a portion in the dietary kind of commandments we have. They're called the Word of Wisdom in the church, where we don't drink alcohol, tea, coffee, we don't smoke. And then there is a section of it which is you need to make up your own choice. Cola drinks is right in that. Like, the church has never made any official statement on cola drinks, but people have often assumed, members of the church, Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, don't drink Coke, because there are a lot of members that choose not to drink it. I choose not to drink cola drinks because that is my view on an interpretation of what the word of wisdom means. But I tell you what, there's probably things that I eat in excess, right, that other members choose not to in their view and how they adhere to the word of wisdom. And no member is in a position to condemn each other where we set that line outside of the flat, very clear there parts where it's like no alcohol, tea, coffee, and no illegal drugs, of course, and no smoking, right? That's the flat baseline. But after that, it's personal choice. And if a member of the church chooses to drink cola, right, that is not sinful or anything to be condemned, even though it's my personal standard is different. And it is evil for me to impose my personal standard where I am at in my spiritual journey on other members of the church. And this is just one example where there's actually multiple examples in our faith where this understanding, where there is a personal level of empowerment on its members to choose what their offering is to God, okay? And by the way, I think sometimes going too far and being too dogmatic can be actually sinful as well. We're too overly strict and condemning things that are not sinful as sinful, right? Being overly judgmental in that sense. That's also a bad thing. That is sinful as well. And I think this nuance needs to be understood when we are looking at this from Brandon's religious perspective, because I have come across members of my own faith that are attacking Brandon for his own line that he is drawing in terms of the acceptance of LGBT, both rights and individuals, and how that aligns with church doctrine, specifically a absolute cornerstone, fundamental part of our doctrine, which is known as the family proclamation to the world, which outlines some very clear things, but I want to share some nuance to that, okay? Because Brandon has not abandoned the family proclamation. People think that he is by certain positions he has. So, I want to say, there are some doctrinal kind of interpretation standards that Brandon has that I wholeheartedly disagree with. But I do not go so far to assume that it's not founded on either scripture or a perspective that I could see where it's coming from. I've discussed certain things with him already, and I also know he's a very smart guy, right? He isn't doing this because of appeasing the woke mob. It actually is coming from a scripturally founded perspective on what he thinks will bring people closest to God, and at the same time not contradicting fundamental doctrines from his interpretation and view of it. Now, if you have a different view, perhaps like me, all right, to then condemn Brandon as preaching false doctrine or going against the church, I think is wrong, especially in the sense that he has still sustained the prophet. And I listen to what he has said. Quoting Brandon now, this is what he has said. I do not represent the church, and I trust the leaders to lead it wisely. I am patient with them and accept that if what I want never happens, then that is God's will. Okay, so Brandon has voiced things that he feels should change in terms of church practices, but then said if it does not happen, he believes that to be God's will and that he is wrong. He has gone on to say, I believe Russell M. Nelson is the prophet of God and it's his job to speak for the church and for God, not mine. Okay? Brandon would only be acting in apostasy if he was saying that his views are where he thinks the church should be in terms of culturally, not necessarily doctrinally, because his views come from a doctrinal perspective. I can almost guarantee that, all right? And if you're wondering where, I can give an example, and look, I'm just kind of guessing that this is probably where Brandon's coming from. I don't know the exact scriptures, but there is clearly different perspectives you can have on both scripture and the way that God treats and interacts with his children on earth. But going back to that apostasy thing, it would only be apostasy, all right, if he was saying that the church leaders were wrong for not believing or viewing the things that he says. He has said very clearly that if this isn't the way the church goes, the prophet, what he says, that he's wrong. Where he says that if they do not adopt those views based on the choices of the prophet of God, that is God's will. It is the prophet who speaks for God and the church, not him. He is sharing a perspective that he has gained from multiple scriptural points. And where it comes from, what I feel, I think, where Brandon is accepting more so of many more conservative-leaning people, of LGBT representation, other things like that, is him trying to find the line where acceptance and Christ-like love and understanding is, where that line is, versus condemning sin. And that is a hard line to draw. People have gotten it wrong in the past, and there are examples in the scripture. Let's look at a very important one. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him, meaning Jesus Christ, a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, the Saviour, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. So no confusion as to the crime she committed. Now, Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. And when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast the stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. And when Jesus lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto him, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. The reason why this is so important is that this woman had been unquestionably been found committing sin. And the Saviour's response was to not condemn her. He didn't excuse the sin. He said, Go and sin no more. But he did not condemn her. This is the standard that I think we should try and understand better. When it is very clear, the Bible and Scriptures, and especially if you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with the family proclamation of the world, crystal clear as to the standard God holds in regards to both gender and what is sinful and what is not in regards to sexual acts, not sexual attraction, okay? The doctrine is very clear that having a temptation, an inclination towards sin, you could say an attraction to sin, is the natural state of our current imperfect world. For the natural man is an enemy to God, and has been since the fall of Adam. The fall of Adam being the time when man became imperfect, and have this imperfect mortal flesh where we are so inclined and susceptible to sin. Someone being gay, being attracted to someone of the same sex, someone dealing with gender dysphoria, or any number of other temptations. This is no different to many other temptations. It's no different to me being enticed or attracted to women who I'm not married to. That is not sinful, and it is not wrong in the sense that this is the natural state of mortality. It is clear about lifestyles and sexual acts. The standard is no sexual relations outside the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman. Family proclamation is very clear on that. The Scriptures are very clear on that. Now, there are people who will adopt lifestyles that are sinful. And then the question is it our job or position to condemn them? Would Christ have condemned them if they were brought before him? And what was the penalty for homosexual acts in Christ's time as well? It's a stoning as well. It was death, all right? The Scriptures say that those who do that and those who partake in it and take joy in it are worthy of death. That's in the Bible, okay? Would Christ have condemned them to death if they were brought before him? I think we have the standard that he would not. His desire was to help people overcome sin and come closer to God. And condemning people doesn't help them do that. But by encouragement, and as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we are given the tools that should be used to help people overcome sin. By persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned, by kindness and pure knowledge, which shall greatly enlarge the soul, without hypocrisy and without guile. And notice how it says without hypocrisy, okay? He who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. Now, of course, there is a section here, reproving betimes with sharpness when moved upon by the Holy Ghost, and then showing forth afterwards an increase of love towards him whom thou hast reproved, lest he esteem thee to be his enemy. I think the primary goal, and perhaps we who are very anti-woke and even militant in our opposition of the things we see as evil, I think I can do better in this, and perhaps this is something that I could learn a bit more from Brandon's example, because the goal in our quest, our standards in trying to stand up for what is right, and not accepting, what is sinful as virtue, one of the ways that we need to try and go about it is in such a way that they not see us as their enemy. And to show them an increase of love if we are guided to reprove. I think I can do better in that. And what I see in Brandon trying to reach out to the LGBT community is him trying to do this. There are lengths that he has gone to with his desire to show love to all people and an understanding, and it's with the intent to try and help them come close to God. Okay? And I truly respect that that is his intent as to why this is the reasons why he's got, representation in his books, the LGBT things, not to appease a woke mob. It's him trying to understand people and to also reach out and build connections, okay? He has said public things where he wants to build these bridges with the LGBT community to help encourage them to come unto God. There are lengths that he's gone to that I do disagree with, that I think do go too far, but I understand that this is where he is coming from. One of the things I disagree is that he says, this is quoting him, they would love, for example, to see the church recognize gay marriage among its members both temporally and eternally, and I would support ordained trans men in the priesthood. Now, I think that goes against doctrine as we currently understand it and what has been revealed. I think there would have to be some almighty big revelation that would explain a certain context about greater and lesser laws, because I think this is where some things that people are kind of missing from an LDS perspective. And I sympathize that there's probably a good number of other Christians that will not understand this. This is a Latter-day Saint kind of understanding of scripture and doctrine. And it's their understanding that there are higher and lesser laws. I actually also think a lot of people criticizing Brandon from our own church is also not learnt this part about what is pretty solid kind of scriptural interpretation practice in our church about higher and lesser laws. We believe the law of Moses was a lesser law instituted by God because the Israelites that were freed out of Egypt were not able to live the higher law. The Old Testament actually says very clearly that the intent was to make of Israel a nation of priests. Should I actually look this up just so people know I'm not pulling it out of my rear end? Exodus 19 verse 6, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Thing is though, if you're familiar with the Bible, that was not what Israel became. In fact, the priesthood was restricted to the tribe of Levi and later prophets that were called. This did not happen. Our interpretation of the larger kind of guidance, commandments that God gave Moses as he came down from the mount and found the Israelites dancing around the calf, and those ones that he destroyed, like threw down and broke the head off, had the fullness of the gospel as Jesus Christ restored. And we also believe that it was this fullness of the gospel that got established with Adam through Noah. And there's paths of restoration of this gospel and apostasy through the main prophets in each dispensation. And that was the intent with the dispensation that Moses was called to do. But the Israelites were not worthy to live up to that higher law. And so they were given a lesser law, the law of Moses, which was kind of keeping them under the thumb because they were so ready to turn aside from the standards God was wanting them to live by. And it's an example of when God initiates a lesser law because people are not ready for a higher law. And we do have that belief that there are lesser laws and higher laws. And so when Brandon talks about that there might be a different thing God commands, I get the feeling he's probably thinking of lesser and higher laws. Now, I personally don't think that there is a different kind of commandment that could possibly restructure the eternal nature of marriage between a man and a woman. This is where And look, I can't represent what Brandon, where he comes from doctrinally, to justify that marriage between homosexual marriage could be ratified or justified by God, because he does say, quoting Brandon now, that he would love to see the church recognize gay marriage both temporally and eternally, which means he thinks that there's some mechanism that would justify gay marriage in an eternal sense. And I do not see that. I disagree with it completely, but I get the sense that Brandon probably still has a doctrinal interpretation that leads him to that. And here's the thing. If he still sustains the church and obeys the commandments, right, I'm not in a position to point my finger and say, shame on him, you're interpreting things differently. Our own apostles have interpreted scriptures differently and have disagreed very strongly. Perfect example is evolution, and how evolution, if it played a part at all in creation or not. Each apostle followed the doctrine very clearly. These are the fundamental truths that God has established. And by the way, remember, we don't just have the Bible as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. We have a larger body of scripture, all right, that we look to when trying to understand things that have not been revealed. And then, all right, that lays the foundational principles of the creation. Both apostles did that, and not contradicting any of those things, they each had different interpretations. It was Talmage, it might be Joseph F. Smith. I need to relook that up as to the exact apostles, and I know Joseph Smith was one of the prophets, but and this is not Joseph Smith, this is Joseph F. Smith, different prophet of the church, right? But I don't think it might have been him. But anyway, it was when he was an apostle that both apostles disagreed. One believed that evolution was a mechanism, the means in which God brought about the creation, that it fit in perfectly fine with the account of the creation as members of our church understand it. And one of the apostles disagreed, okay? Yes, it was James E. Talmage, and at the time, apostle and future church president Joseph Fielding Smith. Reading from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints article, Organic Evolution, Latter-day Saints and their leaders found themselves on both sides of the issue. James E. Talmage and John A. Whitsoe, two professional scientists who became apostles, regarded scientific discovery of truth as evidence of God's use of natural laws to govern the universe. Meanwhile, apostle and future church president Joseph Fielding Smith believed that the biblical account of the creation did not allow for the long spans required for species to multiply through evolution. Addressing these differing opinions, Church President Heber J. Grant and his counselors in the First Presidency urged leaders not to take sides on the issue, requesting in 1931 that they leave geology, biology, archaeology, and anthropology, no one of which has to do with the salvation of the souls of mankind, to scientific research while we magnify our calling in the realm of the church. They weren't contradicting fundamental doctrine, but they were drawing different conclusions from it. And so I think it is too foolhardy to point the finger at Brandon and claim he is spouting false doctrine, even though I disagree with him, and technically I think that is false doctrine, but I'm not going to say that I'm right or he's wrong, and especially not that he is denying the faith, because he is supporting the faith, he sustains the church leaders, and he says very clearly that, look, if the church doesn't adopt these things, that's God's will. He says that, all right? That is not the words of an apostate or someone who has abandoned the faith. And I'm saying that as someone who fundamentally disagrees with some of his conclusions, his doctrinal kind of interpretations. And I am saying that because I haven't heard him explain how he gets there. I don't know what scripture is justifying. I'm just kind of intuiting and just showing an example that, look, there is, I can see means whereby someone might interpret and reach that conclusion based on Mormon doctrine. That's not to say that is the way Brandon is approaching it with those scriptures that I'm mentioning. Priesthood is another interesting thing because there is a different interpretation, even within our church amongst certain members, that they propose as potentially opening up a possibility that women might be able to receive the priesthood, because there are certain conditions in which women in our church do join in some priesthood ordinances. I've also come across, and this is speculation, this is not doctrine, but if you're not aware, members of our church love to speculate on other parts of the doctrine and the scriptures that haven't been revealed by God. And I think it's fun to do. I'm not condemning people that they do it. The thing that I encourage every member to do, though, is understand what the fundamental foundation is of our doctrine, and make a very clear distinction when you're talking with other members, stuff like that, what is doctrine and what is opinion, okay? Prophets and apostles have had opinions, some that we can look back on seeing being rather silly. Like, you should look at some of the opinions Brigham Young had. Some of them are wild, right? They're great, but some of them are pretty far out there, okay? You're still a prophet of God. Prophets are allowed to have opinions, and they're allowed to speculate as well, even though we as members give far more weight to the opinions of prophets. That's not to say every opinion they hold is revelation direct from God. Prophets are pretty darn clear when they're speaking as the mouthpiece of God, right? And so you can take that as account. And when they don't say that they're not, you can take it, understand that, all right, this is them both doing a number of things. One, sharing opinion, but also sharing a view, a perspective that they feel is most beneficial for the members to hear at that time to help them follow the commandments of God. Okay? But when they do speak as the mouthpiece of God, they're very clear about it. And going back to us, all right, when we have our own speculations, I think that needs to be like, this is the doctrine, this is opinion, okay? And a lot of members like to do it. And one of the theories, and I don't give it much weight, right? And this is, again, this has never been taught in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was just a random thought that one of the members shared with me one time about doing the thing. We like to speculate. And one of the concepts that they floated, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's just one of the examples of things I've heard of members speculating about, is that could the priesthood only been restricted to men because it was Eve that ate the fruit before Adam did? I don't think that's correct, but it's an example of speculation that I have come across members having, all right? And it's an example of one of those things, it falls in the same category of why is the priesthood only restricted to men? Some members might think, maybe, I don't know if Brandon does, but they might consider that the priesthood being restricted to men might be a lesser law. Other members think it's a fundamental nature of eternity, both gender and priesthood authority, and you cannot give the priesthood to anyone other than men, because when women are blessed through the priesthood and even join in priesthood ordinances, they're using it vicariously through the men who hold the priesthood, and they believe that is also the case of God in heaven, that the priesthood cannot be given to anyone other than men, and it contradicts the fundamental nature of reality to believe so. Like, I've seen both interpretations in the church. Okay? Opinions. These are not taught in the church. These are just members having fun speculating after the fact. Like, the church is very clear about what you teach in Sunday school and at the pulpit. Fundamental established doctrine, not opinion. Okay? Yes, and not to say it hasn't happened, by the way, but corrections also are then shared afterwards and things, and the church does a very good job overall in making that distinction, that we teach what the doctrine is, as has been revealed, and leave speculation when teaching in the church. But it's never condemned or denied members having conversations among themselves or even publicly about sharing their own views and interpretations. By the way, I have done that as well. I have a video talking about the level of prudishness and perspective in terms of immodesty and other things, including pornography, on this channel, sharing my own personal interpretation of scriptural doctrine, okay, that some members of my church might actually disagree with. They might sit a different standard, but I of the strong opinion I'm correct, because I feel it's very founded on clear scriptural evidence, and I share that in that video. And Brandon might have some very clear scriptural, points that he is thinking of to justify these views. I don't know what they are. At the moment, of course, I disagree with it, and I'll say I'd even agree with him, even if it was to explain where he's coming from as the doctrinal foundation of these opinions that I think are incorrect. But to point the finger and say he is denying the faith is, I feel, very, very wrong. From everything that I have seen of Brandon, and also, as I've talked to him and everything like that, he is a very, very faithful member of our church. And so I would encourage every member who sees him being more progressive than perhaps we would be, try and understand where he's coming from. And if you disagree, you are more than free to hold your standard, as I do, that stands in opposition to what Brandon is saying, but let's not condemn the other for it, okay? People have done far worse things that have not been condemned by Christ, okay? And especially in the sense that Brandon is approaching it from the perspective that he feels this is the thing that will help the most people, especially people who identify as LGBT and so on, come closer to God. That's why he's doing it, in my opinion, even though I disagree with certain lengths that he goes to. So in summary, I don't think Brandon has gone woke. I don't think this stuff is going to be in every single book he writes. If it's not for you, perfectly fine. It is fair. It's your right to choose so. Don't write him off or shun him or anything like that. So don't cancel him. There are people who make media, entertainment media, who have a truly vile view of what conservatives and religious Christians believe, okay? And we end up watching a lot of the media they produce if it's just, doesn't have any of the subversive stuff in it, okay? If we're willing to do that with so many people, how about we give Brandon the same charity, and he is one who definitely deserves it, because in contrast to people who are more progressive than us, who hate us and everything we stand for and attack us, everything like that, Brandon is the opposite. He is one of the nicest, most genuine, Christ-like people that I have interacted with and seen, and I'm judging this based on his actions and how he treats people, okay? He is a genuinely great person, and I think is a great representative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Not necessarily doctrinally in every instance, but in terms of being Christ-like and showing a greater increase in love to all people, I think is a good example for that. And look, I could be wrong. I think I'm right. I wouldn't make the video if otherwise. We'll get to see in his future books, and I look forward to reading them because he's a great author, and I enjoy great stories. So perhaps that's where you are. You'll have to wait and see. Same with me. And we'll do that, as we always, stay on watch.